Okay, in this section, we're going to extend our application, and instead of working with hard-coded data, we're going to get the data from a database using Entity Framework. Now, if you are familiar with Entity Framework, feel free to skip the first 2 lectures where I introduce Entity Framework and Code First workflow. But make sure to watch all the other lectures and complete the exercises at the end of this section. Now, let's get started. So what is Entity Framework? Entity Framework is a tool we use to access a database. More accurately, it's classified as an Object Relational Mapper, or ORM, which means it maps data in a relational database into objects of our applications. In the old days, before Entity Framework, we had to do this mapping manually, which involved opening a connection to the database, executing a command, reading the data, and finally remembering to close the connection. With an Object Relational Mapper, we don't have to do this stuff anymore. So we work at a higher level of abstraction. Entity Framework provides a class called DB_context, which is a gateway to our database. A DB context has one or more DB sets which represent tables in our database. We use LINQ to query these DB sets, and Entity Framework will translate our LINQ queries to SQL queries at runtime. It opens a connection to the database, reads the data, maps it to objects, and adds them to DB sets in our DB context. As we add, modify, or remove objects in these DB sets, Entity Framework keeps track of these changes. And then when we ask it to persist the changes, again, it will automatically generate SQL statements and executes them on our database. So this is Entity Framework. Now, there are 2 ways or 2 workflows to use Entity Framework. One is called Database First, the other one is called Code First. And that's what I'm going to cover next. So there are 2 workflows to use Entity Framework. The traditional way is to design database tables first, and then have Entity Framework generate the corresponding domain classes. This approach is called Database First or DB First. The other way to use Entity Framework is the opposite direction. So we start with our domain classes and have Entity Framework generate the database tables for us. So which approach is better? I personally always favor Code First to Database First, and there are a few reasons for that. First and foremost is that it increases our productivity. We don't have to waste our time with table designers. It's much faster to write code. For example, in the last section, we quickly created a few domain classes like movie and customer. Creating the corresponding tables would take significantly more time because of all the clicks that we have to do when using table designers. Also, when we create the tables using a designer, we need to manually create a change script in order to deploy the database. If you have done this before, you know that creating and managing these migration scripts are tedious and error-prone. The second reason I prefer Code First is because we get the full versioning of our database, and we can migrate it to any version at any point in time. So if you're maintaining an older version of an application, we can migrate the database to an earlier state. In Code First, we use migrations for that, which I'm going to cover next. The third reason I prefer Code First workflow is that it makes creating an integration test database super simple. We're going to look at integration tests in the second part of this course. And there I will show you that we can create an integration test database with only 3 lines of code. If you have ever written integration tests for a database built using DB First workflow, you know that this often requires far more than 3 lines of code. Now, there are a few misconceptions about Code First. One is that it's only useful with greenfield or new projects. Some people claim that if you have an application with an existing database, Code First doesn't work. And this is a true myth. I have successfully used Code First workflow on legacy databases that were built with poor practices. The benefit of using Code First with existing databases is that you get the full versioning of your database from the moment you switch to Code First. Plus, you won't waste time creating tables and migration scripts anymore. You just build your domain classes, which is much faster. Another misconception about Code First is that it doesn't give you full control over the database. Again, this is a complete myth, and I've explained this in detail in my Entity Framework course that you can find on Udemy. In my opinion, all these arguments against the Code First workflow comes from people who don't have in-depth understanding of code first. So if you're working with people who are used to a certain way of doing things, you should first educate them about the benefits of modern approaches. And in my experience, sometimes this is difficult because humans by default resist to changes. So here's my advice to you. If you want to be a successful developer, especially a web developer, you need to be willing to learn new things pretty fast. You need to let go of the old way of doing things and always keep yourself up to date with the latest practices. Otherwise, you're going to miss out on a lot of opportunities. So in this course, I'm going to use the Code First workflow to build our database. Again, if you want to learn about DB First or Code First in detail, it's best to take my Entity Framework course on Udemy. Because in this course, our focus is purely on ASP.NET MVC, and I don't want to spend too much time explaining things that I've already covered in another course with 6 hours of content. Next, we're going to look at Code First migrations. So in Code First workflow, we start with the code. Every time we modify our domain model by adding a class or modifying one of the existing ones, we create a migration and then run it on the database. So let me show you how it works. First, we need to go to Package Manager console. So under Tools menu, go to NuGet Package Manager, Package Manager console. The first time we want to use migrations, you need to enable them. So we type enable-migrations, and this is not case sensitive. Okay, migrations are enabled. Let's go to Solution Explorer. Now you see a new folder here, migrations. So all our migrations will be stored here, as you will see shortly. Now back in Package Manager console, I'm going to create our first migration. So we execute add-migration, and here we give it a name that identifies the kind of change we have made to our domain model. Because this is our first migration, I'm going to call it initial model. Okay, beautiful. Back to Solution Explorer. Look, under migrations, we have a new C# class. So open this. So here's our migration. You see a call to create table method. And here's the name of the table being created, ASP.NET roles. If you scroll down, you see ASP.NET user roles, ASP.NET users, and so on. So why is this migration creating these tables? Where are they coming from? Well, this is part of ASP.NET Identity, which our project uses to control authentication and authorization. Let me show you something. Back to Solution Explorer, expand models, and open Identity Models. Here we have two classes, Application User and Application DB Context, which derives from Identity DB Context. So this is the DB context that I told you about earlier. It's the gateway to our database. Now, this Identity DB context is part of ASP.NET Identity Framework. So when I executed add migration, Entity Framework looked at our DB context, and it discovered DB sets in Identity DB context, which reference classes like user, role, and so on. And that's why in our migration class, you see calls to create these tables for ASP.NET Identity. Now, if you scroll down in this class, you will not see any references to our domain classes like movie or customer. Why? Because they are not referenced by our DB context. So I'm going to go back to Identity Models. And in Application DB context, I'm going to add a DB set. So prop DB set of customer and call it customers. So this DB set represents the customer table in our database. I'm going to leave DB set of movies as an exercise for you at the end of this section. Okay, now that our DB context is aware of the customer class, I'm going to go back to Package Manager console and recreate our migration. So first I'm going to clean this up, CLS. Now add migration, initial model. Because it already exists, I'm going to use the force switch to overwrite it. Okay, the code is modified, so let's reload it. Now let's go back to our migration class and search for customer. There you go. You see this migration attempts to create a table called customers with these columns, ID and name. These columns are based on the properties of our customer class. You can see ID is an integer, it's not nullable, and it's identity column. And name is a string. Now let's run this migration and generate our database. So back in Package Manager console, I'm going to run update database. Okay, beautiful. Let's go back to Solution Explorer. I'm going to click this icon to show all files. You can see under app underline data folder, we've got this database file. Let's double click this. Okay, here's our database. Look at the tables. So we've got these ASP.NET tables, which are for controlling authentication and authorization. We also have this customers table with ID and name. There is also one more table here, which we should not touch. It's called migration history. So this table keeps track of the migrations run on this database. Next time we run a migration, Entity Framework will put that in the migration history so it knows what version our database is currently at. All right, our domain model is pretty simple at the moment. So I want to add a bit of complexity to it to make it more real world. In the customer class, I want to introduce a couple new properties. It's subscribed to newsletter and membership type. So I'm going to make up a business rule here. We can have a few membership types like pay as you go, monthly, quarterly, and annual. Customers who like to be on pay as you go membership don't have to pay any fees to sign up. When they rent a movie, they will be charged per night based on the rental fee of each movie. But if they choose to sign up on a monthly, quarterly, or an annual plan, they will have to pay some upfront fee, but with this, they will get a discount when they rent movies. To model this, we need a new class called membership type with properties like sign-up fee, duration, and discount rate. Each customer should have one and only one membership type. Now, when it comes to implementing this using the code-first workflow, instead of making all these changes in one go like Big Bang, we should make small changes, create a migration, and run it on the database. With a Big Bang migration, you increase the risk of things going wrong. And that's one of the reasons many developers who try code-first workflow fail. You should treat these migrations like your source code repository. You make small changes to the code and commit it to the repository. This allows you to better version your code. The same principle applies with migrations. So now in models folder, I'm going to open up customer, add a new property. Bull is subscribed to newsletter. Now I want to create a migration. So back in Package Manager console, add migration. We give it a name. Add is subscribed to customer. See, with a small change, we can easily name a migration. But if we combine multiple changes, naming the migration will be difficult. Okay, migration created, update, database. Beautiful, no errors because I worked on a small migration. Now the second change. So in Solution Explorer, right-click models, we add a new class, membership type. So here we need a few properties, sign-up fee, duration, and discount rate. For sign-up fee, I'm going to use short because we don't need any values more than 32,000. So prop short sign-up fee. For duration, let's use byte because the largest number we want to store is 12 for 12 months. So byte duration. Now the problem with this name is that it doesn't tell me whether this is in days, months, years. So let's change this to duration in months. That's more specific. For discount rate, let's use byte again because this is going to be a percentage between 0 and 100. Discount rate. Now, in Entity Framework, every entity must have a key, which will be mapped to the primary key of the corresponding table in the database. By convention, this property should be called either ID or the name of the type plus ID. So let's create a new property, prop byte. Again, I'm using byte because we have only a few membership types. And call this ID. So this is our membership type. Now we need to associate our customer class with membership type. So back to customer class. I'm going to add a new property, membership type, and just call it membership type. This is what we call a navigation property because it allows us to navigate from one type to another, in this case, from customer to its membership type. These navigation properties are useful when we want to load an object and its related objects together from the database. For example, we can load the customer and its membership type together. You will see that later in this section. Now, sometimes for optimization, we don't want to load the entire membership object. We may only need the foreign key. So we can add another property here, byte, and by convention, we're going to call it membership type ID. So Entity Framework recognizes this convention and treats this property as a foreign key. Okay, our domain is updated. Now we need to add a migration. So back to Package Manager console. Let's clean this up, CLS, add migration. Let's give it a name, add membership type. Okay, now update database. Beautiful. Okay, now let's go back to our database. So in app_data folder, double click this database file, right click tables and select refresh. Okay, here's our membership types table. Currently, this table is empty and we need to populate it with some records. These records should be consistent across different environments. So our development database, testing database, and production database, they all should have the exact same membership types. How do we ensure this consistency? Well, first of all, because we're using code-first workflow, we should not touch this database at all. Every change in this database should go through a migration. So we're not supposed to open this table and insert a few records. Instead, we use a migration. Let me show you how it works. So back to Package Manager console. I'm going to add a migration. Add migration and call it populate membership types. Okay, let's take a look at this class. So it's an empty migration. Now in the up method, we can call the SQL method and pass a SQL statement here. So we can type insert into membership types. The columns are ID, sign up fee, duration in months, and discount rate. And then we pass the values. So for pay as you go membership type, ID is 1, sign up fee is 0, duration in months is 0, and discount rate is 0 as well. Now with ReSharper, we can duplicate this line using Control D. It's easier than copy and paste. Now for the second membership type, we need to change these numbers. So for monthly, ID is 2, sign up fee is $30, duration in months is 1, and discount rate is 10. Duplicate. For quarterly, ID is 3, sign up is $90, 3 months, and 15%. Now, alternatively, we could use a floating point number here, like 0.15 instead of 15. But it wouldn't really make much of a difference at the moment, so let's not worry about it. And the last membership type, ID is 4, sign up fee is $300 for 12 months and 20%. So earlier I told you that the argument that code-first workflow doesn't give you full control over the database is false. And this is the reason. Because with this SQL method, you can run any SQL statements. So you can modify your database any way you want. Now let's run this migration. Back to Package Manager console, update database. Beautiful. Now in Solution Explorer, in Migrations folder, you see all the migrations from the beginning of time to the current version of the application. Any changes in the database schema or the data in the database is properly coded here. So when it comes to deploying our application, if this is the first deployment, we can get all these migrations from the beginning of the time to the last migration. And using a command in Package Manager console, we ask Entity Framework to generate a SQL script, which would include all these changes. And then we run this SQL script on the production database. But if this is not the first deployment, meaning we already have a database, we can find the last migration run on that database and create a new SQL script from that migration to the last one. Again, the process is the same. So you see, with Code First Workflow, we have full control over versioning of our database in a consistent way across all environments. And that's why I love Code First Workflow. In the next lecture, I'm going to talk about overriding Code First conventions. Okay, in the database, open up the customers table and look at the name column. Its type is nvarchar of max, and it's nullable, as you can see here. Earlier, I told you that there are a few conventions built into Entity Framework, which are used to determine the schema of the database. In our customer class, the name property is a string. In C#, the string type is nullable, and there is no limit in terms of the number of characters you can store in it. And that's why Entity Framework defined this name column as nullable and set its type to nvarchar of max. Now let me show you how you can override these default conventions. So in Solution Explorer, open up Models, open the customer class. Above the name property, we apply a data annotation or an attribute called required. This annotation is defined in this namespace. So if you're not using ReSharper, type using system.componentModel.data annotations. Now with this attribute, our column name will no longer be nullable. We can apply a second attribute here, string length, and specify the maximum number of characters, like 255 characters. So this approach of overriding default conventions is called data annotations. It's simple, but it has limitations. We also have another approach called Fluent API, which is really beyond the scope of this section. So if you want to learn either of these approaches in detail, it's best to check out my Entity Framework course on Udemy. Now back to Package Manager console. We need to create a new migration because we have changed our domain model. So add migration, apply annotations to customer name, and then update database. Beautiful. Now let's go back to SQL Server Object Explorer. Now right-click the columns folder in customers table, refresh. Look at the name column. It's nvarchar of 255 characters, and it's not nullable. Next, we're going to look at how to query objects using Entity Framework. Okay, now look at our customers controller. This is my solution to the exercise in the last section. So here in the index action, you see a call to get customers method. And let's take a look at the implementation of this method. Look here, I have hard-coded a list of 2 customers. I want to get rid of this private method and instead get the customers from the database. So first of all, we need a DB context to access the database. So by convention, we declare a private field, private application DB context, and we call it underline context. We need to initialize this in the constructor. So ctor tab underline context equals new application DB context. Now this DB context is a disposable object. So we need to properly dispose this object. The proper way to do it is to override the dispose method of the base controller class. Here we call context.dispose. In the second part of this course, I'm going to show you how we can delegate instantiating and disposing objects to a dependency injection framework. This way our code will be cleaner and we can unit test this class. But that's beyond the scope of this course because this is for beginners, so don't worry about it yet. Now, back to our index action. Instead of calling getCustomers, I'm going to initialize the customers variable using context.customers. So this customers property is a DB set we define in our DB context. So with this, we can get all customers in the database. Now, one thing you need to know about Entity Framework is that when this line is executed, Entity Framework is not going to query the database. This is what we call deferred execution. The query is actually executed when we iterate over this customers object. For example, in the view, let's take a look. Control B. So here we are iterating over that customers object, and that's when the query is actually executed. Alternatively, we can immediately execute the query by calling the toList method. We need to make one more change in this controller, and that is in details action. Again, here we're using this getCustomers, so we want to replace this with customers in the database. Underline context.customers that single or default. Again, with this line, our query will be immediately executed because of using this single or default extension method. Now you can see this getCustomers method is grayed out, so we can get rid of it. Delete. Now to test this, I'm going to go in the database and populate the customers table with a couple of records. So right-click customers, view data. Now you might want to say, but Mosh, you just told me in the last lecture that we should not modify this database directly. But in the last lecture, we had a different scenario. We wanted to populate membership types, which are part of our application. Membership types are reference data, so they should be consistent across different environments. But in this case, we are working with customers. It doesn't matter if we have 2 customers in our development database or 3 in our testing environment. When we deploy our application, we only deploy the migrations. So the arbitrary records we put here will not be deployed to the target database. Now, customer John Smith is not subscribed and is a pay-as-you-go customer. Mary Williams, subscribed and is a monthly customer. Now let's run the application, Control F5, and go to list of customers. Okay, beautiful. Our application is working. Let's click on this link. So the details page is also loading the customer from the database. Okay, in the list of our customers, we're currently displaying their name only. What if we wanted to have another column here with the discount rate available to each customer? So back in Visual Studio, let's go to Views, Customers, Index, scroll down. So first I'm going to add a new column in the heading. So TH, tab, discount rate. Now when rendering the customer, we add another TD here and render customer dot membership type dot discount rate. Save, back to the browser, refresh. We got an exception. Why? Because by default, Entity Framework only loads the customer objects, not their related objects. So membership type is null, and that's why we have a null reference exception here. Now to solve this problem, we need to load the customers and their membership types together. This is what we call eager loading. So we go back to our controller. In the index action, when referencing customers, we use the include method. And here we pass an expression that determines the target property. So C, as in customer, goes to C.membership type. Now we have an error here because this include method is an extension method that is defined in a different namespace. So we need to go on top of this file and import using system.data.entity. And the error is gone. Now let's build the application. Control-Shift-B. Back to the browser. Refresh. Beautiful. Now to make this a bit more user-friendly, let's add the % symbol here. So back in the view, I'm going to add % here. Razor View Engine is smart enough to understand this part is a C# expression and this symbol is just plain text. Save, back to the browser, refresh. There you go. So throughout this section, you have noticed that when using Code First workflow, we use Package Manager console quite often. So in this lecture, I want to show you how to create a custom shortcut to quickly bring up Package Manager console. Under Tools menu, go to Options. Under Environment, select Keyboard, and here type Package Manager console without a space. So here's the command in Visual Studio. We can give it a shortcut. Put the cursor here. Now hold down the Alt key and press slash and dot. Because slash and dot are next to each other on the keyboard, I find this a very convenient shortcut. Plus, it doesn't conflict with existing shortcuts. Now click Assign, and finally OK. And with this, you can easily bring up Package Manager console like this. Okay, now it's time to put what you have learned in action. In this section, I'm going to give you 3 exercises, and I want you to do them one by one. Do not skip any of them, because every single exercise in this section includes challenges that you will face in the real world. Now, at the end of each exercise, look at my solution in the GitHub repository for this course. In the list of commits, you can see that we have multiple commits for exercises in this section. Don't look at all of them. Only inspect the one for the exercise you're currently working on. So let's start with the first exercise. In the list of customers, I want you to replace discount rate with the name of membership type. Now, our membership type currently does not have a name property. So you need to modify the domain class and update the database using a migration. Then you need to create another migration to update the existing records in the database. You need to use the SQL method for that. But instead of using the insert statement, you need to use the update statement. So pause the video and spend 5 to 10 minutes on this task. When you finish, look at my solution on GitHub and then move on to the next exercise. And one last thing. If you get stuck, that's perfectly fine. Remember, you are learning ASP.NET MVC, so don't set high expectations for yourself. If you get stuck, look at my solution and then update the project on your computer. Then move on to the next exercise. So pause the video and get started. Okay, the second exercise. Let's click on a customer. In the customer details page, now we have more details about that customer. We have their membership type and birth date. Birth date is a new property that you need to add to the customer class. Now let's go back and click on the second customer. Look, this customer doesn't have a birth date. So birth date is an optional or nullable column, and we render it here only if this customer has a birth date. So as a hint, you need to define the birthday property as a nullable date time, and manually set the birth date for one of the customers. And finally, in the view, you need to render it only if it has a value. So go ahead, implement this, and when you're ready, move on to the next exercise. Okay, the third exercise. I want you to populate this list of movies with movies from the database. Also, note that here we have a new column called genre. Similar to membership type, genre is reference data that needs to be deployed with our application. So make sure to populate the genres table using migrations. Now, when we click on a movie, we see the details about that movie, including the genre, release date, the date it was added to the database, and the number in stock. By the way, all these properties are required. Now let me give you a few hints to point you in the right direction. The first step is to add a DB set of movie in application DB context in identity models file. Now the reason I said you need to add this DB set here is because if the movie class is not referenced by the DB context, it won't be included in your migrations. So that's your starting point. Next, you need to add the additional properties in the movie class. This includes genre, release date, and so on. And finally, you need to create another migration to populate the genres table because this is reference data. Once you make these changes to the domain model and the database, then go ahead and make the necessary changes in the movies controller and the corresponding views. Okay, in this section, you learned the fundamentals of Entity Framework Code First workflow. More specifically, you learned about code first migrations, seeding the database, overwriting conventions, querying objects, and eager loading. In the next section, we're going to extend our application and add a form to create and edit customers and movies. So I will see you in the next section.